Hello, everyone. My name's Dennis Pilon. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Politics here at York University. I want to welcome you to our event today. Thank you for coming out. It's great to have so many people interested in our event. I've got a couple of things that I want to talk about before I turn you over to our host for the event. Let me begin with a land acknowledgement. York University recognizes that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that long precede the establishment of York University. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Tekaronto has been taken care of by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee, I always have difficulty with these, Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. I would like to open up our event by noting that this series of events that have been organized by our Packer visitor in social justice, John Clarke, is dedicated to Leo Panitch. Leo Panitch, a longtime professor in the Department of Politics, a longtime activist for social justice and much published scholar on class politics. Passed away this last fall from the combined effects of COVID and other issues. And so this series has been dedicated to his memory and his leadership, particularly in establishing the Packer Fellowship. So we note that in the beginning. Another thing I'd like to mention is some thanks. Thanks in terms of helping to put together this fantastic series. First thanks goes to, of course, John Clarke for his thought in terms of all the different themes and the people that he's brought together. Thanks to the Global Labor Research Center, which has handled a great deal of the administrative aspect of pulling these sorts of events together, which should not be underestimated. So thanks to them. The Department of Politics, of course, is a co-sponsor of the event, and the event has benefited from some funding support from USA, the York University Staff Association. Let me also note, before I turn things over to John, some instructions to our audience. Live captioning has been enabled for this event, so if you would like live captioning, you can turn that on. There is no chat box for this event, so you can't sort of keep chatting while the speakers are going, with their presentations. However, we do have a Q&A question, and so if, as we go along, some questions come to mind, questions that you would like to have the different contributors respond to, then you can put those questions in the Q&A section, and John Clarke, as the host, will read those questions. He'll group them together where they make sense, and he'll direct them to the appropriate panelists. So that is going to be our instructions for the audience as we go forward. Let me wrap things up and turn things over to our host, John Clarke, by mentioning a few things about John. John is our current Packer visitor in social justice. Every few years, we appoint we have a Packer committee that looks at all different sorts of people who have long experience of doing social justice. And we think that it's really important that those kinds of people come to the university and share their knowledge. They have a distinct perspective that they can offer that is different from the way that academics typically take up these questions. And John is certainly no exception to that. John Clarke has had decades of experience working for social justice, particularly in the fields of poverty and self-activation, self-organization of the poor, the homeless, the underhomed, the underjobbed. However we want to put it together, John has been actively involved and a leader and supporter of those movements. And so we were very excited to be able to ask him to take up this position here at York University. And he's been at it now for a couple of years, doing a fantastic job. So at this point, I want to turn things over to John to be our host and set out what's going to happen for today's event.
Thanks very much, Dennis. So welcome to this this second panel in the series, in which we're going to grapple with the whole question of social struggles and how we deal with this changed reality of the pandemic triggered crisis that we're facing. And today we're going to deal with struggles for racial justice. In some ways, the immediate focus is the question of racist police violence. Um, One of the great struggles that's emerged in the midst of the pandemic followed, of course, the police killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis, and we're all very aware of that. But the question of the struggle for racial justice and how that interweaves with the struggles that we're taking up is a really fundamental question, and we're going to try and grapple with as many aspects of that as we can today. So I'm going to introduce each of our really vital and important panel members. I'm going to introduce them each before each of them speak. And then we're going to turn it over for questions. So please remember to put your questions in writing into the Q&A section, and we're going to turn it over and deal with the questions for as long as we can. So I want to begin by introducing Rajon Hoylett, who was formerly president of the Ryerson Students' Union here in Toronto, and was also chairperson of the Canadian Federation of Students Ontario. But Rajon is also now a member of the Toronto Prisoners' Rights Project, and we'll be speaking about the struggle for prison justice and prison abolition in this part of Turtle Island. So over to you, Rajon.
Awesome. Just start my timer over here so I don't go wildly over time. Thank you so much for inviting me to be with all of you today. It has been an incredibly busy and taxing and hard time for those of us that are working around the issues of incarceration, and I'm excited to be here with all of you today to talk about and to gain some clarity around the sort of direct connections between what it is that is happening inside prisons and jails across this country, across Turtle Island, across the world, and what has happened with the pandemic, and how these sort of two crises are intersecting and are directly an issue of racial and colonial capitalism. I just wanted to start off first by, I think, making that connection, because I think as I go through the rest of the conversation today, it'll become more apparent that what it is that we are struggling with right now with the pandemic is really just an issue of racial and colonial capitalism. It is an issue of where the priorities of the state, and so many states like it, has been to put private property over the sort of value of real people and their lives within our society. The pandemic has unearthed what already so many of us know about our society. And when we look at who's being affected by the pandemic, we are looking at the same people who are time and time again deemed disposable by almost every single institution, especially the most violent institutions within the state. I'm going to borrow a little bit from prison abolitionist Ruth Gilmore, who talks about this violence often as a sort of collaboration of both organized violence and organized abandonment. And under all political stripes here in Turtle Island, at sort of every level from municipal up, these two policies of organized violence and organized abandonment have been the priority. And it has not only sort of been within prisons and policing, although those have been some of the most violent, the most horrific to look at. This sort of policies of organized violence and organized abandonment have taken root within every single institution within the state. There's a kettle on behind me. I'm just going to turn that off before I can see it. My apologies. Where we are right now, within the pandemic, where we're seeing so many people that are left without homes, that are being made sick, that are out of work, that are being forced to work while sick, that are don't have the sort of protections that they need, is a direct response of the fiscal priorities of this government and governments that have preceded it. We can look at sort of the rise of incarceration and the priorities of the state at that time, and it points to a direct issue not only of the fact that we are using incarceration as a sole means to be able to govern our society, but also then taking away from the kinds of supports that people need. If you look at the onset of the war on drugs in 1992, when I was born, but at federal and provincial levels, we saw police receive $400 million in funding, while things like treatment services receive less than $88 million. We already know how much of an abject failure the war on drugs has been across Canada, across Turtle Island, and has just led to the mass incarceration of Black, Indigenous, people of color. Prison expansion particularly has been a fiscal priority when the government has also enacted significant austerity measures across the board. We've seen cuts to social investments in almost every other sector besides prisons, policing, and the military. We look at education, childcare, welfare, pensions, union wages, women's group, homelessness and prevention programs, HIV and Hep C prevention treatment, community support for migrant and Indigenous peoples. All of these sort of services and protections have been cut as we are also simultaneously continuing to dump money into these institutions, which have not been proven to work, have not been proven to equal any more safety or any more success or wellness for the people that live here. Particularly, this is an issue of racial justice when we consider who it is that is being harmed by these institutions. It's important to also think or to know that prisons were first created to harm workers. Things like the RCMP and policings were first created to be able to support the colonial project of this land. But as like in the sort of creation of the state of Canada, Black people were already, by and large, at some level of incarceration, being held in slavery, being held without rights, and so there wasn't a need to incarcerate Black people sort of en masse. It's when we make the transition from slavery into the sort of subsequent iterations of it that we see prisons and policing sort of explode, and Black people today are subject to some of the most invasive surveillance at the hands of police when just trying to exist in public. Prisons and policing really are just here to further this colonial project within all of our institutions. When we look, Black folks sort of at every level of the criminal system are disproportionately represented, from sentencing to carding to like the length of sentences, all of these different things. Indigenous bodies as well. In Canada, Indigenous peoples make up about 5% of the population across the country, but make up a quarter of the total prison population. So these institutions are being specifically used as a tool of racial and colonial violence. And as we have gutted our social support systems to be able to continue to prop up this institution that we know is harming Black and Indigenous people, we have gutted any kinds of supports that could prepare us to deal with a pandemic on the level that we've seen today. This pandemic is for a lot of us outside of our imaginations, like nothing that we've ever experienced before or seen on a global stage here in the places that we live. And a huge reason that we have not had the resources to be able to deal with it is because we have prioritized this sort of organized violence and organized abandonment over being able to care for people and to ensure that people have access to all of the resources and supports that they need. What the pandemic has also done for us in sort of prisoner justice organizing and prison abolition is make possible and make urgent the demands for abolition. During the first waves of the pandemic here, we saw a rise in prisoner activism. We saw things like a hunger strike for migrant detainees in Bordeaux that led the call for decarceration. Across most provincial institutions, you saw prisoners taking up hunger strikes, which is, on the upper levels of risks and actions that you could take as a person living in this world, to deny yourself food, to put yourself and your well-being in harm's way directly, to be able to demand justice. And we saw, in provincial institutions where prisoners serve 2 years less a day, where the sort of history of activism has sort of waned and not been as prevalent, we've seen hunger strikes in almost every single provincial institution across the country. And this activism has, in a lot of ways, been really successful. We've brought and shed unprecedented attention to what is happening inside these institutions of disappearance that sort of thrive on, not being looked at under a microscope and analyzed by society. We saw a 30% reduction in the prison population provincially. And these things have led us to go from calling for prison reforms or calling for things that we know are helping to raise the confidence of people to be able to talk about prison abolition, to knowing that prison abolition is the way forward. We have seen how harmful these institutions can be when something like a pandemic hits. When you look at the sort of rates of infection at places like Joyceville and Maplehurst, at the Toronto South Detention Centre, just to name some institutions here in Ontario that have seen massive outbreaks, when you consider that the prison population is often an aging population with pre-existing health conditions, we know how deadly this pandemic would be if it were to enter these institutions. And so beyond the reforms to be able to keep people safe, to be able to demand that these institutions be sort of tinkered and altered with, what we really know is that there is no level of safety inside prisons, and what we really need is prison abolition. And so the pandemic has given rise to a bolder call for prison abolition, being led by prisoners who are taking on hunger strikes, who are taking on dramatic action to say enough is enough, and this is the justice that we deserve and demand. The deaths of folks like George Floyd and Breonna Taylor in the U.S., Regis Korchinski-Paquette, Ijaz Chowdhury, DeAndre Campbell, Aisha Hudson, Jason Collins, Chantel Moore, Rodney Levy, Sheffield Matthews, and so many more people here in Canada have led to the very public calls to defund the police, a call that you could hear echoed in almost every single city, that has become so loud that you could probably see it from outer space. Defunding the police has become top of mind for so many of us, has become starting to highlight this priority of organized violence over being able to support real people. In Toronto, we just saw a 35% reduction in policing budgets, which is definitely one step of where we need to go. Because abolition is not just about defunding these institutions of organized violence. It is fundamentally about addressing the conditions that create the harm and the crises that we are experiencing collectively before this pandemic, and as we move from out of this pandemic. I think that when we, at the sort of onset of the pandemic, a lot of us that were doing prison abolitionist organizing, we were horrified and scared about what would happen to our loved ones inside. But we were also, really, I don't think enthusiastic is the right word to use, but we were really hopeful, because we know that the conversation that we are having as prison abolitionists would be sort of uptaken as a response to this pandemic, because really it is the only redress that we have available to us to be able to address the most harmful aspects of the state that we are experiencing now under this pandemic. It is one of the few movements that are calling for a revolution of how it is that we are living, and again, to borrow from Ruth Wilson Gilmore, towards a world in which all life is precious. We are directly talking about creating systems of transformative justice, of mutual aid and care, and the pandemic sort of just at the onset, when we look at what has been happening in neighborhoods across the country, the pandemic has led to people taking on abolitionist organizing, recognizing that the state is not here to keep anybody safe, and that mutual aid programs, mutual aid groups, caremongering groups, that kind of things is what is necessary to be able to make sure that we are checking for each other and looking after each other. And as folks that are within the abolitionist movement, that is what we saw sort of coming. Before, we were talking about prison reform, and we were talking about things that would help us raise everybody's confidence to be able to talk about prison abolition. But now we are talking about abolition, about decarceration, defunding, dismantling these systems that are harming us, but also in engaging in this process of creation that will ensure that we are all taken care of. And it has been a long struggle. It has been a hard struggle. That over just the last year of the pandemic, it has felt like things that might have happened over the course of our lifetime has all happened within sort of a year. The deaths that have resulted as a result of the pandemic inside, all of these different things have been incredibly emotional and incredibly taxing for organizers, for folks that are inside, for folks that have loved ones inside. But it has also led to this sort of catapultization of prison justice organizing. A huge part of our movement too is to, because we know that we are engaged in this struggle of creation, we have not been limited to just talking about what is happening inside in prisons. And a lot of the work that abolitionists have been taking on has been to support people without homes, supporting things like the Encampment Support Network here in Toronto, speaking to things like the climate emergency, and seeing abolitionists within the climate justice movement linking these issues sort of directly, and talking about the lack of protections for workers and across the board, and talking about housing and public housing and those kind of supports that are available for folks. We were just talking to some folks inside that were highlighting, when they lock up some of us, they're those same people, their mothers, their family members that are housing them in public housing, they're throwing them out into the streets. And so this sort of issue of incarceration is hitting so many of us on so many different levels. And so we've needed to really have alliances, to really have struggles that speak to one another across the board within prison abolition. And it is a reason that we are here today, in which abolition can be talked about so publicly across the board with so many different people. I would say that abolition also is a revolutionary struggle in which we all have a part to play. We all have a sort of a venue to be able to do this work. Abolition, unlike a lot of struggles, or the sort of organized violence that we're sort of coming up against within abolition, is present everywhere that you look. There's nowhere that you can turn that the same thinking that has fueled the creations of prisons, the creations of policing, isn't present. When you just look at how we've talked about things like the pandemic, using the terms of lockdowns and the very policing language that we've used, it is an example of how policings and prisons and this kind of violence is a knee-jerk reaction of this state to almost any crises. If you look at the school system, the use of suspensions and expulsions as a knee-jerk reaction to be able to discipline people, to be able to just have this threat of ostracization, this threat of no longer being able to participate in these institutions, there is no one who doesn't have a direct tie to being able to do work around prisoner justice, to do work around challenging policing and challenging the notions. Because within all of the institutions that we work within, live within, this sort of thinking has been so cancerous and so insidious that it has affected every single part of where we live. While we're engaged in this struggle for abolition, we also know that today there are people that are inside, that are being sort of put up as the um, as the tributes to demonstrate how horrific and awful the system has been, and how deadly the system has been. And so while we've been making these cries for abolition, we also know that a lot needs to change right now, today, to be able to contribute to a harm reduction strategy that says that our loved ones that are caught up in the criminal system are not disposable, that they deserve to live, that they deserve to be with us here. And so it has been why we have continued these calls on demanding safety for people inside, demanding that folks are taken care of inside, have access to adequate medical care and medical attention. We've seen the sort of horrific comments from folks like Doug Ford and Aaron O'Toole, who have been beyond dismissive of prisoners being vaccinated, but very violent and criminalizing of these populations and of these people. And so we have been pushing as folks within the Toronto Prisoners' Rights Project, as folks within abolitionist struggles across the country, to elevate the demands and the voices of people inside. I will also just share in the chat as I'm going to wrap up a call to action from prisoners inside to be able to address some of the conditions. We've seen over 1,000 people already in Ontario take on to signing this declaration, but really what it is that we are trying to do is to save people's lives and to avoid the preventable deaths that we know are coming with this pandemic, as we are in the second wave with new variants, and seeing that I spoke earlier about the 30% reduction in prison population. As we are seeing those numbers start to rise, a lot of us with loved ones inside, with people inside, are terrified about what that means today. And so as we talk about abolition and revolution, we're also talking about keeping people safe today. And so I'll share the statement. There's actions to come, in which hopefully we'll be able to talk to as well.
Oh, thanks so much, Rajon. So just to remind people, if you have questions, please get them in the Q&A. Given the nature of this panel, it's very possible that you'll have a question for a particular member of the panel. So start getting them in as soon as you like. Our next speaker is Hayley Pessin, who is a member of the Afro-Socialists and Socialists of Color Caucus of the Democratic Socialists of America, and will be speaking very vitally, I think, on fighting for Black lives in the Biden era. Thanks, Hayley.
All right, I'm also going to time myself just in case. Thank you all so much for having me. I think you'll see a lot of what I say is going to resonate with what Rajon said, which is a good thing. I want to start by looking back at the summer uprising against racism and police brutality in the US. Of course, following the police murder of George Floyd and the rebellion in Minneapolis, something like 15 to 26 million people mobilized and protested against police brutality, making these not only the largest protests against anti-Black racism, but possibly the largest protests of any kind in US history. These protests marked a watershed in the fight against racism, in that they were both more widespread and more militant, yet received greater solidarity throughout US society than protests of the civil rights era, or even protests of 2012 in response to the murder of Trayvon Martin by a neighborhood watchman, or the protests of 2014 in response to the police murders and subsequent acquittals of the officers who killed Michael Brown, Eric Garner, and Freddie Gray. Not only did last year's protests spread to major cities and Black neighborhoods, they also emerged in rural and largely white communities in the US, remarkably spreading even to former sundown towns, that is, towns in which Black people were previously lynched if they were found after dark. And of course, this also generated immense international solidarity, not only against anti-Black racism in the US, but also against racism in the home countries. In a matter of weeks, this most recent iteration of the Black liberation movement completely shifted the national conversation about racism and policing. In addition to the massive police presence that meets Black protesters anytime they resist, at the hands of the state. This all occurred in the unprecedented circumstances of a global pandemic, meaning thousands of people chose to protest in defiance of stay-at-home orders and curfews allegedly imposed for their own safety and at risk to their health and lives. Meanwhile, police enforced these safety measures by deploying extreme force, with Trump at one point threatening, though failing to call on the Pentagon to send in the military to suppress the rebellions. In important ways, these protests were not only more militant and more widespread than previous Black Lives Matter protests, they also embraced more radical and far-reaching demands. An astounding 56% of Americans felt that the burning of a police precinct in Minneapolis was justified or partially justified. Over 11,000 protesters were arrested in just the first few weeks of the uprising. Yet the brutality they face at the hands of police actually brought more people into the streets. And protests continued for weeks on end, sometimes with multiple protests a day in the same city. The largest protest ever for Black trans lives occurred in New York City, and activists markedly expanded their focus on the plight and erasure of Black women like Sandra Bland and Breonna Taylor killed by the police. In addition, a conversation that was previously confined to the corners of the anti-racist and radical left was forced into mainstream discourse about the futility of efforts to reform the police, what alternatives to the police might look like, and even the question of police abolition. Now, fast forward to January 6th, when an armed far-right mob marched into the US Capitol building with encouragement from then President Donald Trump to oppose the results of the US presidential election. The contrast between these events points to the depths of political polarization within US society, which has only grown in response to three interlocking global crises: the pandemic, the economy, and the crisis of the mainstream political establishment. Trump became the first president in history to face impeachment proceedings twice for his role in inciting the Capitol occupation, as Congress members voted to ratify Biden's victory. Congresspeople were sent fleeing for their lives, and 5 people died in the ensuing events. At least 8 Republican Congress members apparently knew about or even participated in the Capitol attack. While Republican responses to the attack have varied, an astounding 2/3 of people believe that Trump lost due to widespread voter fraud, lending at least some credibility to the Capitol protesters. That's 2/3 of Republicans. Just yesterday, Louisiana Representative Steve Scalise, a leader of the Republican faction in the House of Representatives, personified this ambivalence by acknowledging the legitimacy of Biden's election, yet refusing to concede that the election was somehow not stolen. In reality, voter fraud is extremely rare in the US, while voter suppression is a far bigger problem as a means of making voting more difficult in predominantly Black neighborhoods who tend to vote Democrat. So while more Republicans crossed party lines than during any other impeachment in US history, they fell far short of the votes needed to impeach Trump, suggesting the extent to which the party has refused to reject Trumpism, if not fully embrace it. More importantly, I think the events at the Capitol revealed the growth of an increasingly violent, openly racist, and even fascist far-right in the US. This is not to say that all who participated in these events adhered to a hard right ideology. In fact, most were not members of any organization. But the plan to storm the Capitol came about through coordination on an unprecedented scale between various far-right and white supremacist organizations, including the 3%ers, Oath Keepers, Proud Boys, and other right-wing gangs and militias. Of the initial 175 people who were arrested for their participation in the storming of the Capitol, 21 were members of these organizations. 22 were current or former members of the military, and at least 2 were identified as police officers. In contrast to the general way that Trump's voting base is portrayed, which I think is inaccurate, usually portrayed as being white working class people. In fact, the people who participated in this storming and who represent more of Trump's actual voting base were predominantly middle class, were people who were facing some sort of economic devastation due to the pandemic, but also who were either small business people or people who represented that strata of society with a little bit more disposable income, certainly to fly on a plane at a cost of however many dollars at a time when most people are facing massive unemployment. Trump's catastrophic response to the pandemic has resulted in nearly 500,000 deaths to date in the US. Yet 70 million people cast votes for him. And so while the far right remains a minority and has been marginalized for now by social media platforms, they are not going away after Trump leaves office. At the same time, these events should not be seen exclusively as a response to Trump's electoral loss. They must be understood in context of last summer's mass militant uprising, which represents the left-wing side of this political polarization. In fact, the far right has increasingly come to see itself as explicitly counterposed to Black Lives Matter, as well as Antifa, short for anti-fascist activists. It's no coincidence that those who stormed the Capitol carried not just pro-Trump signs, but also anti-Semitic and racist imagery. Some marched carrying the Confederate flag, a symbol of the Civil War battle to maintain slavery and white supremacy. That same day, in Los Angeles, a crowd of Trump supporters physically attacked a Black woman, shouting racist slurs and chanting "White Lives Matter." We saw precursors to these attacks last year in Portland, Oregon, and in Kenosha, Wisconsin, where a far-right terrorist shot and killed 2 Black Lives Matter protesters. These protesters were responding to video of a white officer who had shot a Black man named Jacob Blake 7 times in the back. The day before the Capitol occupation, prosecutors announced that they would not be filing any charges against the officer who killed Jacob Blake. To some degree, both the police and the far right have largely acted with impunity, while those seeking justice have borne the brunt of state repression. And so both represent threats to the current anti-racist struggle. Nevertheless, the sheer scale of last summer's uprising suggests the importance of putting that threat in perspective. Estimates of how many people participated in the Capitol insurrection vary widely, from as few as 800 to as many as 10,000 people. That is compared to the millions who protested just months ago against racial injustice. As was already stated, the most prominent demand that has been launched by this movement is the demand to defund the police. Rather than seeking to reform the police, activists aim to decrease the power of the police and their overall presence in Black communities. The demand to defund the police is also a call to reinvest in the communities that have been most decimated, both by decades of neoliberal gutting of the social safety net, but especially during a pandemic that has disproportionately killed Black, Indigenous, and Latinx people. Moreover, the movement has also called into question the notion that the primary role of the police is to keep us safe. It is significant that the mainstream media, not just those of us on the left, immediately noted the disparity between how police responded to the mob of armed white supremacists who stormed the Capitol versus the tear gas, rubber bullets, and mass arrests deployed against protesters demanding an end to police brutality. Even President Joe Biden had to acknowledge that if the crowd outside the Capitol had been Black Lives Matter protesters, the police response would have been very different. This is not just because the protesters were white, although that is true. It has also been widely reported that far-right groups planned the attack on the Capitol months in advance over Twitter and other online forums, in other words, right in plain sight. The US has one of the most sophisticated surveillance states in the world. Yet police somehow failed to secure the Capitol. In fact, officers let the mob inside, took photos with the crowd, and directed them to the offices of progressive politicians. Today, abolitionists and left-wing activists are not the only ones questioning whether we can rely on the police to stop white supremacist and far-right violence, given their everyday role in enforcing racist terror. In fact, police and Border Patrol officers were among the professions where support for Trump has remained strongest. Part of why people have been willing to risk their health and their lives despite the pandemic is because so little has changed in 6 years to stop the police from killing Black people. Eric Garner literally uttered the same words 6 years ago that George Floyd said as an officer kneeled on his neck for over 8 minutes, "I can't breathe." We have also seen how little efforts to reform the police have changed the fundamental role that they play in Black communities, such as requiring cops to wear body cameras, hiring more Black police officers, or conducting racial sensitivity trainings. In fact, all of these measures already existed in Minneapolis prior to George Floyd's murder. Their failure to significantly curtail police brutality is precisely why the rebellion was sparked. Perhaps the most incredible example of this occurred during protests in California, where a San Jose officer shot a rubber bullet and permanently injured the man who spent 3 years leading the police through anti-bias trainings. Now more than ever, people are realizing that the role of the police is not to keep us safe. They're often the primary force endangering Black lives and Black communities. As austerity measures have been imposed on what little remains of the social safety net, the police have been brought in to respond to a wide range of social problems, from mental health emergencies to disciplining children for misbehaving in school, with deadly consequences. Police have regularly killed about 1,000 people per year in the US, with Black people being killed at a rate twice as high as whites. While police departments around the country receive a combined $115 billion per year, the budgets for basic social services, education, housing, and even healthcare are facing austerity during a global pandemic. This is particularly enraging given the disproportionate impact COVID has had in those communities. As major cities continue to hire police while crying poverty when it comes to funding the essential services needed so desperately to alleviate mass hunger, mass unemployment, and mass death, the pandemic continues to expose the extent to which not just Trump, but also the Democrats who run these cities care more about protecting property and profits than workers' lives. In turn, they rely on the police to survey and control the most economically deprived and marginalized segments of the population, those most likely to resist. Of course, the United States was founded on genocide of Indigenous people and the enslavement of Black people. The police themselves have their origins in slave patrols designed to prevent rebellions of enslaved people. But because anti-Black racism remains so central to the functioning of American capitalism, that is preserving and protecting the mass inequality that exists in this society, it means that resistance to racism, particularly anti-Black racism, has always had an especially explosive character. Whenever this struggle goes into motion, it has never been confined to struggles for equal rights within the existing order. Instead, it has always thrown up bigger questions about the entire society and how it fails everyone but the 1%. And this brings me to Biden, who was essentially elected and whose election was widely seen as a means to rebuke Trumpism. But this is in stark contrast to what his candidacy and current presidency have represented. They were essentially candidacies of low expectations. Biden spent at least as much of his time attacking Trump in his campaign as he did the left wing of the party, and particularly attacking the demands of the anti-racist uprising and the demand to defund the police. In fact, he has continued to blame this demand for Democratic losses in battleground states, while also continuing Trump's policies by other means, with the shared aim of putting America back to work, even as COVID cases far outpace those in other countries, and the vaccine rollout remains it really has faced enormous delays. This is in keeping with Biden's own record, as well as his running mate and now Vice President Kamala Harris, who spent much of their political careers building up the system of mass incarceration as it's been deployed against Black people. Any left policies that Biden has been open to are less a function of his openness to being pushed by the left than they have been a function of the desire of the ruling class to return to a status quo that was already intolerable for Black people, and which, by its failings, actually helped to pave the way for Trump and co. to pose themselves as a political alternative. At the same time, many mainstream commentators and Biden himself are already seeking to strengthen and increase anti-terrorism laws in response to the Capitol insurrection. As I'm sure this audience is aware, such a law already exists in Canada, where Minister Bill Blair recently designated the Proud Boys and other white supremacist groups as terrorist organizations. While it's tempting to see this as a positive development in condemning white supremacy, I would argue this is actually a dangerous development, particularly here in a country where existing anti-terror laws are already a dragnet that disproportionately targets Muslims, Black activists, and the left. If anything, we should oppose bipartisan efforts to use the Capitol occupation as an excuse to crack down on all forms of protest, including Black Lives Matter and the left. Already, some mainstream outlets have referred to the far right as anarchists. This is dangerous given that Trump has already referred to the far right, Trump has already designated the cities where anti-racist protests were most militant as anarchist jurisdictions. We will need to prepare to protect our demonstrations and fight the right ourselves by mobilizing in mass numbers, outnumbering, demoralizing, and running them off the streets wherever they dare to show up. Exit polls from the presidential election showed that voters cited racial inequality as the single most important issue facing the country today, second only to the economy. This is another sign of the deepening polarization in US society, but it also shows the enormous potential and necessity of continued resistance under a Biden presidency. And finally, I want to speak to the challenges that face this movement as it moves forward. Because there have been enormous setbacks, particularly as it concerns the demand to defund the police. A Bloomberg study showed that in 34 out of the 50 largest US cities, more than half actually increased spending or kept it unchanged as a percentage of their discretionary spending. And so while mayors of these cities have said Black Lives Matter, there's a disparity and a disconnect between their willingness to actually carry out the demands of the movement. And so it's going to take greater organization, greater coordination, and struggles on par with what we saw over the summer last year to actually win these demands in practice, regardless of who is carrying them out. There are a few notable examples where this has been possible, such as in Los Angeles, where voters passed a mandate which stipulates that 10% of the city's general fund be diverted to alternatives to policing and incarceration, not police and prisons. And students and parents, as well as educators, such as the Chicago Teachers Union, have launched important campaigns to cut ties between schools and the police. So we should try to figure out ways to actually build on those successes. But there remains an enormous challenge in terms of the lack of organization that exists nationally to actually be able to carry out these successes. I look to what happened in the civil rights movement, such as the founding of SNCC, where SNCC was essentially founded out of a conference of 200 activists who came together and were able to consolidate the lessons of the sit-ins, which were spontaneous or semi-spontaneous struggles that erupted and began to dismantle the walls of segregation. And they ended up becoming an incredibly important organization for organizing protests throughout the decade and even throughout the more radical periods of the struggle. I think such an organization where we can share the lessons and strategies would be essential for this struggle moving forward. And the very last thing I want to end with is just an anecdote, because I also want to end with the question of prisons and policing that Rajin started with. A friend of mine participated in a protest during the height of the uprisings outside a prison in New York, where I live, where a corrections officer had killed a man named Jamel Floyd, who died after officers pepper sprayed him in his cell. Sorry, I'm living in such a noisy area. Jamel Floyd died after officers pepper sprayed him in his cell on Rikers Island, which is the notorious jail, which is currently housed with many people who have not even been charged with a crime and are yet facing some of the highest levels of COVID-19 and where there's no access to vaccine at this time. And in response to these atrocities, activists launched a campaign called the Free Them All campaign, calling on politicians to pardon prisoners and allow them to be released and housed safely during the pandemic. As protesters marched, led by the family of Jamel Floyd, they could hear the prisoners inside the prisons also chanting back at them, chanting Black Lives Matter, chanting Free Them All, chanting Defund the Police. And what my friend observed was really that suddenly these were just walls. It was nothing but a wall, separating the resistance within the prisons and the resistance outside it. I think this really shows the enormous radical potential that this struggle represents, the sort of moments that of real possibility, and the radical necessity of a society that does not rely on police and racism to maintain such vast levels of inequality. So I'll end there. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Heidi. So our third speaker, before I introduce Wanda, let me just say that as the movement was spreading internationally following the police killing of George Floyd, there were demonstrations here. But at the same time as the demonstrations were taking place, the RCMP across Canada was engaged in a whole series of attacks, some of them lethal, that also generated an enormous response. And so that component of the question of racist policing is absolutely essential to focus on. So I'm very pleased to introduce Wanda Whitebird, who is a member of the Mi'kmaq Nation from Afton, and asked Wanda to deal, at least in part, with the role of the RCMP as Canada's colonial police force. So away you go, Wanda. You need to unmute there, Wanda. There we go.
There you go. I'm unmuted. Thank you for the invitation. Bonjour. Nani Madananga Kredidishikaz Makwadadem. My name is Dancing Star. I come from the Bear Clan. I'm a member of the Mi'kmaq First Nation, and the territory I come from is a little place called Buttongut, which is about 19 miles outside Antigonish in Nova Scotia. Although I live and work now here in the territories of the Mississaugas of Credit, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Wendat. But for many people, the Cree, the Métis, we call Toronto home. Life for us, pre-contact, that means before Christopher Columbus got lost and we found him, was a very simplistic way of life. And if you look at North America as we see it as Turtle Island, there were like 90 million people living there then. 90 million people of different nations, different languages, and different cultural practices. But the arrival of Christopher Columbus began the colonization of who we are as a people. There were, many attacks upon us as Indigenous people. And if we want to look at policing in Canada and the RCMP in the very beginning, there were 5 maximum security prisons in this country just before the turn of the 19th century. Some were built in 1890. Why would we need 5 maximum security prisons? And that question is easily answered by because we want to house other Indigenous people within inside those walls. The Indian Act is one of the most racist legislation that you will ever find. It outlawed our cultural ceremonies, which means we couldn't pray together. It stole our children to the Residential School Act, which means they came into our communities and took our children. Well, who do you think did that? The RCMP, to uphold the laws of the land, came into our communities and forcibly removed our children to take them off to residential school. When the RCMP came into a being, if one RCMP officer spent 2 years on the prairies, they were offered 140, they were given 140 acres of land, of Indian land, that they could live and farm on, raise their families. Only after 2 years of being in the prairies. And that goes back to, the many things that have happened to my people in such a short period of time. I mean, it's still going on. It's not over. The RCMP still enforce laws. And then we come down to now to the murdered and missing Indigenous women. And they said they have 1,182 missing or murdered Indigenous women. But how many of those cases have they even bothered to solve? There's many cases where the RCMP's officers in the prairies arrested a young woman, took her to the RCMP detachment, and an hour later returned in his civvies and took the lady home, the young woman home, to his house, and they released her to him. If we look at the Highway of Tears and what is going on out there around our murdered and missing women, is that no one even batted an eye to see that when our young girls ended up in court, they were before a judge. And yet that judge met them on the back roads outside of that community to engage in sexual activity with these young girls. Not only that, it was the RCMP who met him there. So our young women out in BC in those communities weren't going to say anything because the people who were actually supposed to protect them were the perpetrators. We look at the downtown east side and we look at Picton. They knew, they've been telling them for years before he was even convicted or even, investigated, that he existed. But they didn't do anything. Why? Because the majority of his victims were Indigenous women. These are things that happened within the last 20 years, are still happening. The police are not investigating the murders of our women. A young woman in Regina fell down a laundry chute, which was locked, and died, leaving behind 4 children. They deemed it an accident. And they cleaned up the site before any investigation was even going to be. No investigation turned out to be. So, yeah, the RCMP has been nothing but a thorn in our side and not able to help us. We keep going through the centuries or the years, the decades, to see that to us, the RCMP, the police, aren't here to protect us. Then you move to George Stanley, who shot and killed Colton Bushy on probably the land that was donated 200 years ago to an RCMP officer because he spent 2 years on the prairies, shot and killed this young man, went back into his house and had coffee, cleaned his weapon. And when the RCMP arrived, they didn't readily charge him with murder. And then going through the court system, he was found not guilty. Broke our hearts. It was the heaviest thing that many of us had to deal with. But it's not the first one. It's the most one that got media attention. But there was a man shot in Brantford out towards Six Nations because shot by a homeowner that thought he was stealing his truck. Found not guilty. In many of the smaller communities and health units in the north, there's a video around 2 police officers restraining a young man. Essentially murdering him, but it didn't come back that way. So I don't think that we as Indigenous people will ever look towards RCMP or police personnel to think that they're here to protect us. They're here to keep us in line. From the moment that they imprison us on reservations in this country, we weren't allowed to leave those reservations unless we had a travel permit by the Indian agent who was a native. So there was a pass system. And so we couldn't go visit families on other nations because we were imprisoned on those small parcels of leftover land that they didn't think was good enough to be inhabited by them. They gave to us. And so if we're going to look at the history of Canada and how Indigenous lives matter, look at that, look at the history. It hasn't changed. Recently now our deaths within inside of the medical bio model, where people are not getting any help. Ryan Sinclair died in the ER after 2 days of waiting to be seen for a simple thing as to change his catheter, which never happened. To Joyce, who had courageously taped her death, so that we could hear the racist comments of those around her. But everybody's still dragging their feet. Are there any justice? Oh, West, the Kidderminster Hospital, the Terrace Hospital, the death of a baby who wasn't even born yet, to a man who went to the hospital because he had a problem with his heart, or he had, and they told him after 8 hours there was nothing wrong with him. He leaves the hospital, walks up a hill, and drops dead. Oh, because there was nothing wrong with him. And so we also bring it home here to Toronto with Regis Paquette. They called the police because they wanted help. Well, they got help, all right. The death of their daughter. How can how do you even explain that and think that you can come up with, oh, it was justifiable. It wasn't our fault, it was hers. Well, you had chased her into the house. You were scaring her. And so it's now and time of the pandemic. Again, now everybody's locked up. And so, but we have encampments of my people out living in parks in the middle of winter and surviving because that's the way we've always been able to do, is that we're a very resilient people. And so some really nice individual decides to build them warmer places to sleep. Now the city's taken him to court to try to stop him from building them. When is that all going to stop? Every day of every year, we are subjected to the brutality, not only of the police forces, but of a government who wants to build pipelines and fight for that, who can't even bring clean drinking water to those who live in the north. Many northern reserves are still boiling the water, and some can't even, I can't drink the water. I met a 22-year-old woman just recently, and she's never had water out of the tap. And then I want to bring you to my territory. Finally, after all these years, they started to do fishing, trying to build up an economic base for our people to be able to enjoy reasonable life. And that played out on national television, Facebook, and other. But nothing was done. The RCMP wasn't there to protect us. Oh, forbid that. They were a part of the protests. They didn't stop the attack on my people. They burned boats, shot at people, burnt down buildings, surrounded them inside of a building where they thought the RCMP were going to help them. But it was the RCMP who kept them in that building as they trashed his truck or his van, destroying the livelihoods of the people. When I called home, they were saying that they couldn't even go into the store because people were not letting them in stores anymore. That racist attack on the fisheries department from, lobster fishermen who have their boats, and, that controversy around the environment, that it took the community standing up and writing a letter to saying the RCMP aren't helping us. So basically, they embarrassed them into looking after them. And later charges were laid. But in all fairness, I laugh because, now they own 50% of all the fishing rights along the shores of Nova Scotia. and it was played out. But here in Toronto, people were not outraged. People in the country weren't outraged. They didn't. They just stand by and thought it was, oh yeah, there's your Indian problem again. Fracking in our territories. As we stood up to that, what did they do? They bring in exorbitant police presence, like hundreds and hundreds of police officers in riot gear to suppress our women and children on the front lines. When you look at Standing Rock in the States and standing up for clean water so that we may continue to live on Earth, and what they did to those protesters. Again, it was a private military attack out west, and you can never pronounce the name, but Western people. They brought in, again, a large contingent of police force to arrest women. There was only women in that camp, along with their partners. To what's going on now in Six Nations at 1492 Landback Lane, fighting for the land of their ancestors, holding down the fort and not allowing development on lands that were promised to us by treaties. A treaty is an agreement between two nations, and not one of them was upheld in this country. So, for us, the police have always been a sign of they're going to displace us, take our children. They're not very helpful to us. And there are two other things that have just gone on this week, in the last couple of weeks, that played out in the news. One is the manslaughter trial in Thunder Bay around Barbara Kettner's death by a racist attack to throw things out the window, along with Cindy Gledoux, another murdered woman. But he was found guilty. I don't know what's going, all we get is just tidbits that are put in the media, or we talk to family members who've been there. So when is it going to stop? When is all of the people who want to stand up for us? Is it time? Is my time up, John?
It's just about up. It's just about up, Wanda.
Oh, okay. So if you want to learn and understand anything about the Indigenous people of the lands that we live upon, is ask. Everyone in Canada lives on treaty land. Find out what treaty is yours and find out whose territory that you live in. Something very basic and simple. But you can be sure that by the police in any way, shape, or form for our end.
Okay, thanks so much, Wanda. We have horribly little time left for questions, but there are there's one specifically for Hayley, and then there's a question that perhaps either Rajon or Wanda might be interested in just speaking to quickly, which is it's asked, what organization should we check in with around developing an anti-racist response and networks that would interrupt, challenge police harassment here in Toronto?
No More Silence is we've been around for 16 years doing February 14th prayer vigil. We're involved in whatever's going on around defunding the police. We're in touch with Land Back Lane. So look us up. I'm not a computer person, but I do know we have a page, whatever that means. So it's called No More Silence.
That's great.
If I can speak as well, I would say also, just like as a point of caution, right now the state is scrambling to figure out how to respond to the calls to defund the police, and we're seeing things particularly here in Toronto. There's a group called the Reach Out Response Network, which I think started sort of with good intentions, and then has quickly sort of been taken up by the city of Toronto to be used as a mouthpiece, and sort of publicly they don't support the calls for defunding the police. They're being used to say, okay, here, this is going to be our alternative. This is where we're going to put this funding. Now that the sort of government has pressed forward, and we saw this 30% reduction or 35% reduction in police funding, the people that were community members involved in creating the Reach Out Response Network have been completely written out of that organization and the steps that are being taken by the government. So even though they were being used as a mouthpiece to be able to take these steps, so all that to say is that we will see the city of Toronto, we will see municipalities, provincial governments, federal governments think about how they can coat a state response in some sort of grassroots organizing and activism. And so that's not a very direct list of where you should be looking to, but I would say there are neighborhoods where that are taking on this work to think about how it is that, we are uplifting our skills to be able to keep each other safe, how we are sharing our contacts and information with each other to make sure that folks have people to reach out to. And I think that kind of organizing is the most important for this work to happen, this sort of grassroots community organizing where you live with the people that you live beside, engage in those conversations about what it is that people need. There are so many organizations that are doing this work from an honest and true place, and we need to be diligent as a community to make sure that we are not getting sort of caught up in the state responses to what's happening right now.
Thanks. And a question specifically to Hayley, which is, how do you see the role of unions, especially workers of colour, in the BLM movement in general and protests in 2020 in particular?
Very good question. So let's see. There's a couple of ways to look at that. One thing in terms of the response of unions to the uprising, it's interesting because there were actually conversations early on about kicking the police unions out of the AFL-CIO, which was pretty unprecedented. That's been something that, because the labor movement in the US has been so in crisis and unions have been so in crisis and depleting numbers over time, there's a tension between wanting to hold on to the numbers of people in the union and the actual role of the cops as the only union that can be brought in against other workers' strikes, right? That can actually be brought in against other workers in the interests of their bosses. So the unique role of the police was highlighted, and in a way that I haven't really seen, in recent years. Then there were other more local examples that were quite inspiring. For example, the Teamsters, the transit workers unions in New York and Minneapolis refused to transport the protesters who had been arrested by driving the buses of these protesters to COVID-filled jails. So in other words, they showed solidarity by refusing to drive the buses. So that became a politicized question. Of course, these are workers who themselves are predominantly Black, have been deeply impacted by the pandemic. The numbers of transit workers in particular who've died as a result of contracting COVID have been pretty astronomical. And so these questions are all connected, but there's still enormous resistance. And the reason this becomes complicated is not just because of the power of the police unions, but also because of the power of the Democratic Party, which, you know, again, as I said, panders to Black Lives Matter in some respects. Joe Biden has been pushed to actually speak about white supremacy in a way that we didn't even see under Obama, right? And at the same time, have resisted calls to defund the police because they don't believe it's politically expedient. And it's also not really in their interest to do so. And so the ties between the unions and the Democrats have made it much more difficult for them to actually break with their leaderships. And so there are rank and file efforts. For example, the movement of rank and file educators, which is more a faction of the teachers union in New York, defied their leadership by joining calls to defund the police. So that's, you know, yet another positive development, but that relationship is very complicated. And just to say, I think that both the movement and the labor movement, both this anti-racist movement and the labor movement, have the potential to fuel each other. But I think, again, that greater degree of organization that includes both sides of that equation are necessary. And one really important point, I think, is that we're all being impacted by the pandemic in different ways. The same austerity that's affecting workers is also impacting Black people, and also in particular impacting them in the sense that there's still money for policing. We need to both tax the rich, and we need to call for defunding the police as a way to prevent these layoffs and say that, you know, the people who should actually pay are those who are perpetuating these problems, not the people who are suffering from them.
Great, thanks so much, Hayley. And I just want to thank all of the panel members for their incredibly important presentations. It's been a really, really wonderful panel. Thank you so much. And next week, we're going to start to deal with the question of the threat of mass evictions, which is a really, really vital question. Probably one of the most important struggles that are on the agenda at the moment, with millions of people in the US facing the prospect of eviction, an estimate of at least 35,000 households in this city under immediate threat of eviction here in Toronto. So a really vital question. If we're talking about social struggles in the face of the pandemic, this is one of the key ones that we're going to be talking about next time. So thank you so much, everybody, for participating. Thanks to all who attended, and thanks once again to the wonderful presentations that we had here today. Thank you very, very much.